Good morning, Alex.
Hello, Eddie.
Wonderful to meet up with you again. We last had a very fruitful session on the future human, and that was very exciting and very productive, I think. And it's so nice to be continuing our journey.
Yes,
And you're talking from your home, are you,
yes, I'm in Alicante,
in Alicante?
Spain.
Yes.
And well, we're starting a journey
Hmm.
through the four volumes of your recent
Right.
main work. And it's exciting. We had the
Well,
compressed version, yes, in the Future
you're
Scientist conversation, but here hopefully we'll have many installments to unfold the unfolding consciousness.
unrolled it, yeah. And I must warn you, Alex, that these four volumes do contain full stops. I don't know if you heard the Nobel laureate in literature.
Mhm.
His three volumes were without a single full stop.
Yeah, it's
But he
important to
must,
breathe. It's
but he
important to
must have
breathe.
had many, many semicolons.
Yes, yes.
But we need not fear. Our volumes have got full stops as well as semicolons.
Yes. Let me show them. Well, you have them behind. I have them here. You're so
Right.
kind to send them
Yeah,
to
thank you.
me. Yes, they're beautiful books. Apart from the content, which we'll discuss right here, the four volumes.
Mm, mm,
And well, now that I'm mentioning that, let me just say, indeed, I mean, they're superbly edited. Not just the font, but the colors, the organization, the
mhm.
images, the notes on the margins, the references. It's well curated from beginning to end. It's a pleasure to read.
Thank you for that. It is a complex subject, which is why I went to a great deal of trouble to make sure it was as accessible as possible.
Yes. All right. So how shall we begin?
Perhaps we can begin by just trying teasing out the overall purpose and what drove me to it. Well, using the example of music, if you love music or you want to write something, you do it for love. You don't do it for any other reason. But that doesn't mean there isn't any external pressure. I mean, a publisher may want you to write something, or other people may want it, but you've got to do it out of your innate love for the subject. And I've always had this passion and love for the perennial philosophy, which we'll go into. And um, associated with that, a real desire to link science and spirituality and to bring science to its highest possibilities. Because mainstream science, as we know, Alex, is very materialistic, despite the pronouncement of some of the most enlightened scientists of the world about the spiritual realms. But mainstream science is very materialistic. And by raising it to a higher metaphysic, a higher standpoint, I feel that so many problems we see in the world can be addressed intelligently, not just by resorting to technology, which is, of course, fine, but from a higher standpoint. So, just in a nutshell, I quoted Albert Schweitzer, the great Nobel laureate, of course, as saying that we need three things to progress as human beings. Firstly, is of course progress in technology and science. I'm paraphrasing. The second one is social cohesion. But the third one is progress in spirituality.
Mm.
And of the three, the third is the most important.
Mm.
And the emphasis is on the third, not neglecting the first two.
Yes. Let me mention in the dedication
Mm.
of the
Oh,
book.
yes. Mm.
Yes, because the book is so surprising in certain ways because
Mm.
even before we get into the subject matter, we're really there through, of course, acknowledgments, a dedication, a note to the reader, a proem,
Yeah.
an introduction. So it's like we're crossing all these boundaries. And in the dedication, you write, there is only one way to redeem the world situation. So you use the word redeem. So there's a sense of urgency there. And then you continue, the way of purity and truth, wisdom and love, the way of the unselfed, of the transformed man.
Yes, Alex, that means everything to me. And let me say, that is a quote from someone I knew very well, a very good friend of mine a long time ago. His name was Firoz Mehta, and he was a Parsi Zoroastrian, born into the Parsi Zoroastrian religion like I was. And he, early on in his life, lived in Colombo. And then he studied and qualified in natural science at Cambridge. And he was also a concert pianist, and his teacher was the great Solomon. And he was one of the few, he was the first person to play the Beethoven sonatas in India. And he was a trained scientist, a musician, and equally important, he was a deep scholar and a student, and I would call a sage of the ancient teachings, the eternal teachings. He was a great friend and colleague of Krishnamurti, and had many conversations with him. And that passage I quoted comes from his chapter on Krishnamurti, where he emphasizes that in the world around us, just look at what's happening now. For any problem in the world, there has to be an economic solution. There has to be a financial solution. Well, let's just hold that. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has just cancelled the extension of the high-speed line. Why? For economic reasons. Everything is based on economics, money, economics. No one is knocking that. But what we are saying is that the great sages from any age and any culture, Zarathustra, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Giordano Bruno, Krishnamurti, none of them wasted their time developing economic models, financial schemes. And as I just heard on the news today, Jeff Bezos sending another 1,000 satellites into the air to compete with Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. They didn't waste their time on these technological economic schemes because they realized that these problems come from man's innate nature. When man is healed, then the economic problems will be sorted out. None of these sages, I also emphasize, were so blinkered. They realized the importance, the value of the material life. You know, in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply. Zarathustra talked about family life and procreation and the material life. They were practical. The great sages were supremely practical. They realized the value of economics and money, but that has to come from man's redeemed nature. The evolved man will produce the right economics. The selfish man will produce the sort of economics we're seeing now.
Now here,
so I want central dedication is to that purpose.
And I want to pause you here because we're doing this for our own joy and redemption, if you will, but also for others to listen to. And so the idea is that those who don't know you or your work also get familiar with this, and even more than familiar, I would say. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm going to ask you to explain the use of the word man here, because I know some people can be immediately put off. And I know you have a lot to say. Your words are chosen very carefully. Yes.
In volume 4, in the definitions, I've distinguished very carefully between man in all capitals, man with single capital, and man with small, lowercase. Well, without going into the technicalities, this word man creates a lot of problems, and I'm so glad you pointed it out at the outset, Alex. It has nothing to do with gender. The word man comes from the root mens, which is cognate with the Sanskrit manas, the thinker. It is to do with the thinking principle. So the word man applies equally to male and female. It applies to the thinking principle. But taking this a little further, we have, as Satish Kumar, the head of Schumacher College, he always points out so eloquently that we creatures on Earth are of the earth. So the word human is synonymous with humus, of the earth. And if we pollute the earth, we creatures of the earth are going to pollute ourselves. But man is not just of the earth. Man with the capital, and this is so important. Man is an evolving spark from the divine flame, so to speak. Man has that inner central spark of divinity which expresses through the material principle. So man, capital M, is that inner spark of divinity expressing through the human, the creature on earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nothing to do with gender.
Yes, I think that's enough for now, and
that's enough.
And this will unfold constantly because all these are not just topics we're discussing here. These are not just, it's that and more, like deep ideas. Yeah. I mean, your proposal goes beyond that. Yes,
absolutely. We're not just in an intellectual cerebral gymnasium fooling around with silly ideas. These are, absolutely rightly say, deep topics.
Yes. Now, slowly we're getting into it. Let me ask you a couple of clarifications first. And I don't like this expression, play devil's advocate. No, I'm not playing that at all.
No,
I'm a student, I'm a student.
You're all students.
And also a student of what you're proposing here.
You're all students.
So this idea of transformation, because we unpacked a bit transformation of man, but I want to dwell on the idea of transformation because we tend to think generally, solutions, the 7 simple habits for ... But transformation is again a big word. It presumes, and one can already smell it from the flavor of your words here, like evolution, the cosmic destiny, perhaps. And so transformation is not just changing some habits or doing some arrangements here and there. It's something quite deep, and perhaps people are, although they may feel it inside, we're not used to being addressed like that. So just, it would help me, and I think the ones who would listen, to understand what's at stake here. It's something evolutionary, it's something spiritual, it's something very tangible. What does it mean? Let me just put it in question form. What does it mean to transform our own nature? I mean, it sounds like impossible.
Let's think of how a steel factory, using an analogy, produces a finished article. First, you have the raw material under conditions of heat and pressure, which is then transformed, let's say, into an ingot. That's the first stage only. So that's going from the very crude and primitive to the ordinary civilized. But then that's not enough. That has to be hammered and warmed up and heated to produce the finished thing made of the steel or iron. So in that transformation, there's always fire. And fire doesn't just always mean suffering. It means a lot of self-understanding, self-analysis, and really not parting with one's innate nature, because the finished steel is the same as the original steel, but fashioning it into something which is akin to the original design. So along with transformation, one can also use the word transmutation as in alchemy. And that is something, slightly different as well. So transformation is on one level, if you like. Transmutation is on another level. And I would say, for example, people who've had a genuine near-death experience, like Ibn Alexander, like Rajiv Pati, have had not just a transformation, but a transmutation, because their earlier quite sincere materialistic and atheistic attitudes were completely somersaulted and turned over to a higher philosophical and philanthropic standpoint. So transformation and transmutation there as well.
You've mentioned materialism already 2 or 3 times that I recall, and it's pervasive, especially in the first volume. And we don't want only to preach to the choir. We want to explain. So what's right, I would ask, and what's wrong with materialism?
There's everything right about it in its rightful context. And I go to great lengths in any talk, Alex, to say I am not knocking materialism. I am only pointing out that it has no place when we're talking of these higher realms. So as Schrödinger said in his book, What is Life? Science sometimes pretends to understand or answer these questions in these higher realms, but the answers are so silly that we don't take them seriously. That's Schrödinger. So without materialism applied properly, we wouldn't have all the material comforts and benefits of our life. We wouldn't have our washing machines, our cars, our homes, our electricity. So it is ungrateful and stupid to deny or to castigate materialism. But that materialism is based on the wonderful known laws, physics, chemistry, and in human body biology. Now, if you try and apply also physics to consciousness and higher realms, that's when materialism just falls on its face. Yes. So the other word is scientism. So scientism is the attitude where only physics, chemistry, and material principles can explain everything. And it's not a scientific attitude at all. It's almost a religious ideology.
Yes. Now, again, the prefix trans comes to mind, not in the way it's used today, but we've just spoken about transformation. We could even say transcendence, not just of man's inner nature, but along with it, as I know from your books, is about also transforming science, right? To saying yes to materialism and saying and like as if materialism, I like to see it in this more integrative way, as if materialism was a limit case of
That's a good way of
science as we know it in certain realms. And as you just beautifully said, if you take it out of context, then it doesn't belong. Now, you spoke about these higher realms. What are those higher realms? Because materialists would say, well, these higher realms, whatever they are, they're either material or they're non-existent. So what are these higher realms?
Well, then you have all this hair-splitting academic papers on physicalism and causal closure, and all these arguments about strong and weak closure. Then any physical cause has only a physical effect, and any physical effect, a weak argument, can have a sufficient physical cause. And what's sufficient and what's weak. So by higher realms, I mean, in essence, Alex, the whole realm of experience. The whole realm of experience, near-death experiences, for example. I never fail to, well, meditate is quite the wrong word, but for me, it's deeply inspiring being a music lover. I was in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, and I visited the mortal resting places, if I can put it, of whom I refer to as the three saints in Vienna: Beethoven, Mozart, and Schubert. Now, how does physics and chemistry and biology explain how Schubert, who died at 31, could bring down the heavenly melodies in such a short space of time? Coming to science, the great Sir Karl Popper, talking of Vienna, who was once a member of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism, that's the other side of Vienna, the dark face of Vienna. He himself showed in his book with Sir John Eccles, Materialism, science has transcended the very science that is investigating materialism, has transcended it.
Yes.
Which is quite paradoxical. So we owe science a great debt, gratitude for having shown the limits of materialism.
Yes. No, it's a good sign. It's a good sign when one faculty, you could call it like, you could speak about the faculties in general, but in any case, when one reaches the limits and transcends them by accepting them, and that's what happened, at least that's my interpretation, 100 years ago with modern physics and quantum mechanics, that pursuing the building blocks, we realized there weren't any. And so this is kind of a near-death experience in a way. It's like a transformative crossing the threshold. Now you can just desperately go back and say, no, let's forget about that. And this still happens in biology, as if that hadn't occurred in physics. Or say, wow, with our intellect here, we've reached its limits. Now, what do we do? Perhaps we can attempt to transcend it.
You've said something very significant. Sorry to interrupt, Alex.
Please.
With our intellect, we've reached its limits. Now, in one of the slides I sent you, there was a quotation from Albert Einstein, and no one can deny it and say artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence didn't exist in 1943 when Einstein said those wonderful words talking to the Jewish seminary. He said, I'm paraphrasing, that mankind's very proud of its knowledge and intellectual achievement, but we should never make intellect our goal. Now, intellect has powerful muscles, but it has no personality. Intellect cannot lead, it can only serve. Does that not remind you of Ian McGilchrist's left brain, right brain? The intellect can only serve, it's the emissary. But then Einstein goes on to talk about the intellectual priests, he calls the intellectual priests. And it's no wonder that this fatal blindness, his words, his fatal blindness is transmitted from one generation to another and therefore involves a whole generation. And we are seeing this whole generation of fatal blindness still in existence, where intellect is made the goal. And people do not understand that the truth does not deny intellect, it goes beyond intellect.
Yes,
it does not castigate intellect. It doesn't only go beyond, it goes also above. It's above and beyond.
Yes. I think I've told you before, I can repeat it here. In a way, you are the Ian McGilchrist of occult science and perennial philosophy.
Thank you.
If comparisons serve any purpose here. And precisely, once you reach the limits, you can deny you did so or just go ahead. And I think that's part of what you're proposing here. So speaking about perennial philosophy, tell us what that is. And so I'm very intrigued by the adjective here, perennial. I pay a lot of attention to adjectives because they're so interesting, right? Because we will talk hopefully throughout these installments about what occult science is.
That's very important.
And it isn't. You know, I'm a physicist or neuroscientist, and maybe 10, 20 years ago, or maybe even 5, if you would have said, what's occult science? Like, what? Well, probably it's not science at all. But talking about perennial philosophy, which has this other adjective here, well, what's perennial about it? And also in the context of you bringing it to the urgency we were discussing of today, right? So in a way, it's a double question. What's perennial philosophy, and why are you bringing it in the context of what's going on today with this book?
Firstly, talking of occult, you probably know there is a brand new course called Magic and Occult Science at Exeter University. I think it's the first time the word occult has appeared in academia, and it's so important to restore that word to its original meaning. Right. But perennial, the best example I can give again comes from Albert Schweitzer. Of course, the word perennial goes back a long way. The great Leibniz used the word philosophia perennis. More modern, Fritz of Schuon used the word religio perennis, emphasizing the religious aspect of perennialism. The immortal Isaac Newton used the word prisca sapientia, the sacred wisdom, emphasizing the sacredness of it. Theosophy emphasizes the divine ethics behind perennialism. So what is perennialism? Schweitzer likened it to a tree, an evergreen tree that always produces the same fruit, but never the same kind of fruit. So you have an apple tree or any other tree, let's say an apple tree for obvious reasons. It always produces apples, but no apple is exactly the same as the other apple, making the point that the apple is the eternal principle. It is out of time, but the individual apples are in time. So that which is unspeakable, immeasurable, immortal, has got to be expressed in the language and in the culture in which we live. So it's always the same kind of fruit, but not the same type of fruit, and not the same kind of fruit. Another very lovely analogy, my wonderful aunt, to whom I owe so much, said that all the great sages have dipped their pens into the same inkwell of universal consciousness, the perennial philosophy, but they've written in their individual handwriting.
Yeah.
So the ink is one, but the handwriting is different. And it has to be different because each sage has to write for the intellectual, moral, and spiritual climate in which he lives.
No, these are two beautiful analogies, indeed. Now, something to emphasize about that, now that we're in this introductory conversation, is, at least I want to highlight, the lovely tension, which I think is resolved, or at least maintained without friction, between this universal outlook that perennial philosophy offers or promise to offer, we'll see it, and the respect for the, not just the respect, like the commitment to the plurality of approaches, because there's a tendency when you're trying to have something that's perennial, universal, unifying, of smearing out or homogenizing. And that's a kind of totalitarianism, at least in thinking, right? But that's not what's going to happen here, because precisely this universal outlook maintains and celebrates the very different ways, infinitely different ways, from religion, spirituality, science, the arts, and so on, of entertaining these big
excellent
problems.
point, Alex. Yeah. The universality and unity has nothing to do with uniformity. So paradoxically, the unity admits of infinite diversity in the same way as the white light is unity, but you have an infinite number of colors that can be refracted from that white light. But another way of looking at it is let's just say the human body, each cell, each organ has a unique function, but it works within the master principle of the human body. So the body as such is the unity, is the unifying principle. It has infinite, almost, diversity in its various forms of expression.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole beauty of perennialism is the fact that it admits of infinite diversity, but all of that can be traced to that central orchestrating principle.
Yes. And just to be clear, this is not a philosophical system we're talking about here. Because you could say, okay, we're not talking about science, we're talking about philosophy. Well, yes, but no, we're saying more than that.
Yes, we're saying more than that. We're saying that if we take our sciences, our religions, and our philosophies with a small p, they can be traced back to these eternal principles, which apply to all ages and all cultures as like an algebraic formula. So an algebraic formula applies in all circumstances, well, in which it's formulated. So the simplest formula we learned at school, distance equals speed times time, applies on Earth, applies on Moon, applies on Mars. It's universal. So the perennial philosophy is, in another sense, like the strand that brings together all the various beads on a necklace. The beads are different, but they are united by virtue of being strung together. And for that reason, the perennial philosophy is referred to in Sanskrit as the Sutratma. And Sutratma means the sacred thread that binds, the sacred thread that binds.
This sacred thread
binds, but not uniform.
Yes,
but not makes it uniform.
Now, maybe we can. No. I think we're doing great. I'd like if we could discuss, if we could be a bit more concrete about perhaps the contents of the volumes, because we could start to see what those principles are or may look like, and also, I mean, this totally follows from what you just said about this sacred thread, and also from your analogy about organs in an organism, because we're talking about man, we're talking about life, we're talking about existences, it's kind of this kind of fractal organic structure, right? Not just us, but us in life and life in the universe. But still, what are those principles? Perhaps that'd be more clear, of course. But now, would it be a good time to speak about the 4 volumes and why you organize them like that, and what's in it, what's in each of them?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Well, starting backwards, volume 4.
All right, I like that.
Contains a lot of further reading material, of course, resources and references, but the references are well over 100 pages, so it's a very thorough reference. And the glossary of Sanskrit terms contains the etymology of words, so you can see, so to speak, the consciousness behind the words. So, for example, the word karma, which we always use, the origin of the word is kri, which is action. And action obviously involves and invokes all sorts of things like reaction and other things like that. But if we now switch to volume 1, the overall purpose of volume 1 is a sort of bird's eye or panoramic view, contrasting science with the perennial philosophy. So the first chapters can talk about science, its great benefits and also its limitations, and how we can go beyond those limitations. And associated with that is the old chestnut, the hard and soft problem of consciousness. The hard problem, how can the brain possibly generate experience? The soft problem, people say, oh, well, ultimately neuroscience and physiology will explain that. The soft problem, the hard problem, was the term used by Chalmers, of course. Then we move on to the contribution of enlightened scientists, and there's so many wonderful enlightened scientists besides Max Planck and Schrödinger and Heisenberg and Einstein, of course. There are Sir Alistair Hardy, Julian Huxley as well, the brother of Aldous Huxley, the famous one who also coined the word perennial philosophy. So this makes the case. Having discussed science and its limitations, it makes the case for invoking the perennial philosophy. And the window through that is what I've called a new way of thinking. And I've based a lot of that on the wonderful insights of the great William James, who talked about three productive functions of the brain. First is ordinary production, but then permissive, and most importantly, transmissive. Transmissive, we talked about trans. The brain is a filter, not a generator. And through that window, we come to the mystery teachings, occult science first, and then the mystery teachings. Of all ages, well, I can't talk of all ages in practical terms, but I've talked about the East and the West. We must acknowledge the West as well as the East. So the Indian, the Egyptian, the Greek, but also the rather neglected American Indian wisdom.
Mm.
That's all in volume 1.
Can I pause you? Can I pause you there? Because I want to make a few remarks there. So that's already volume 1. In my view, it's perhaps 2 or 3 books in one book, because on the one hand, it explains the accomplishments of science and it honors them. Then it says, well, but then there's all these anomalies going on in physics, in biology, in the neurosciences. And then these biologies are doors to hopefully this transcendent.
And Rupert Sheldrake is one of the finest door openers in my opinion.
Yes, and I like that there are many doors, because it's not just you must go through here. It's like, well, you can go through problems in biology, problems in the nature of matter energy, problems in consciousness, in near-death experiences. I mean, there's so many, like, it's so porous. There's so many holes through which we can get in and out. But that would be just...
In my father's house, there are mansions.
Yes. So this is one book. This will be one book by itself. But then, of course... And
the appendices talk about the timeline developments in mainstream and enlightened science, mainstream and enlightened biology.
No, just to stress the richness, right? But then, and I was very excited when it was about the time to go into these mystery teachings, because you can be aware of these doors and think, well, there's nothing behind them. Or you could be sure there's something really interesting. But, well, we don't hear so often about these mystery teachings, right? And so to me, I felt it was, well, I had read some of the literature, not a lot, but it was like an introduction, like Mystery Teachings 101. And I think it's something very valuable to scientists, that they can entertain that, and also that they discover historically that many great scientists dwell on that, not just as a hobby. That was really deep work.
No, but it enriched their science.
Yes.
Schrödinger, the prime example, and of course the great Newton, the supreme example.
Yes. So that's one remark for volume 1.
And Einstein.
Yes. I want to say, because you mentioned first volume 4, I very often, when I buy a book, the first thing I go and look at are the references. That might be my academic advices. But I hope we have time towards the end to just talk about those references, like what to read. What are the sources? I mean, there's so many, but there's some really, really important sources. And I love that you just dedicated volume 4 to that, with the glossary and these beautiful timelines.
But also, Alex, the end notes to volume 1, I've summarized the various sources under various headings. So that is, if you like, a top level skimming of the major references. So each volume has end notes talking of the absolutely principal references.
Yes.
So it's simple, medium, detail.
Yes, all levels. I feel like that too. Like you could say, well, now I want to go to premium version of the teaching. Well, you can go. It's in the book. It's there too. If you only want to have like an approximation, it's there as well. So I think that's also something to mention. I think it can appeal to very different audiences, those who are more advanced and those who may have never heard of. Like, let's mention one of these mystery teachings or the axiom, right? As above, so below, for instance. I mean, this is not, Eddie, this is not new agey stuff. This is
no, not at all.
But some people may have never heard of that, of the Hermetic axiom, for instance.
And the great Newton produced his own detailed translation of the Hermetic axiom. It's easy to get caught up in words, but it's really saying that which is here mirrors principles on a higher level, which are projected and reflected onto the level we are now. But equally, we would not be here now without those higher principles. And the great scientists always worked on that basis. When they could not solve a problem on Earth, they looked to the heavens to see what happens there, and therefore what's happening down here.
You see, it's a beautiful synchronicity that we're starting this journey together in October 2023, because October 2023, it's the 400th anniversary, the exact 400th anniversary of Galileo's publishing of the Assayer.
Oh, gosh, thank you.
And look, then volume 2 and volume 3, I mean, we could talk about the Assayer, but let's just leave it there. But just to mention that in that book, which was a controversy about comets, we find the famous statement about the intelligibility of nature through mathematics, but also like the cornerstones of what we consider the scientific method, observation, experience, not appeal to authority, epistemic humility. I mean, it's a fantastic book, and this is the 400th anniversary. But I'm mentioning Galileo because of the scopic, telescopic, microscopic, panoramic view, which are the words you've used to organize volume 1, 2, and 3, right? So this mirroring of, or even holography of, well, if I look up, if I look down, if I look to small things, if I look to big things, it's always the same and yet different. So maybe that's a segue for you to unfold.
Oh, thank you, Alex.
Other volumes,
And I will mention what you've just said to David Lorimer, the wonderful, incredible David Lorimer, who chairs the Galileo Commission of the Scientific Medical Network, and our Galileo volumes have a picture of the telescope, inviting scientists to look through the telescope as Galileo invited his professors at Padua to look through the telescope, and so talking about their concepts.
Yes, totally. And well, this could be edited out, but just to mention in passing that because it's Galileo's month to me, I've organized a series of three online events we'll have through the Pari Center. And in one of them, I'll explain what's in the Assayer and encourage people to go and read from the words of Galileo. It's amazing to just sense also the temperament of the man speaking. So that will be the first session. The second session, I've invited Dean Radin and Avi Loeb, because to me, they represent two contemporary figures that are brave and knowledgeable enough and to explore the outer spaces and the inner spaces. And on the third installment of this event, we'll do it this month, I've invited David and Marjorie and Athena from the Galileo Commission, of course, because what better way to wrap it up just to talk to the Galileo Commission.
Wonderful.
Yes. So this is going to happen. But I mean, this is not, I mean, it's related to what we're discussing, but it's not relevant to the book here. But just to go back, right?
Volumes.
The second one is called Peering Down the Microscope, Man's Internal Landscape.
That's right.
And the third one is Gazing Through the Telescope, Man is the Measure of All Things.
Sure.
And the first one was called A Panoramic Survey, Science Contrasted with the Perennial Philosophy on Consciousness and Man. So you very deliberately used the telescope, microscope imaging.
So peering down the microscope is looking at the atomic level, so to speak, where we talk about not just the physical body, of course, but the subtle bodies and the incredible detail and information given about the subtle bodies. And the word in English is just auras, I mean, that's the usual word, but the aura is multifaceted and multi-structured. It's like using the word body for the physical body. Well, yes, but it's got organs, it's got cells, it's got a blood supply, it's got an energy supply. So we're talking of the subtle bodies. And associated with that, the after-death states, which are so important to try and understand, the after-death states of consciousness, showing that death is transition. Death is only extinction in very, very special cases, which we won't go into. But for the vast majority of people, death is transition, not extinction. Associated with that are all kinds of paranormal phenomena, apparitions and that kind of thing, which had their different kinds of reasons and explanations. That also begs the question of consciousness and mind. If mind is brain, it disintegrates at death, but does it? So there is a major chapter on is the brain just a wet computer, a biological computer made of meat, to use a rather crude expression.
And sorry, Eddie, here, back to your mention of the foundational essay by William James on human immortality of 1898, I think, where he makes the productive and permissive distinction.
And transmissive, yes.
Yes, that allows us to conceive these ideas that, again, to many, I don't know if lay people, at least to many academics, they cannot even conceive the idea that mind or consciousness survives bodily death. But if you think of a brain as a permissive instrument rather than a productive
valve that opens or shuts,
then it's at least conceivable, not to mention the empirical evidence that's out there, which doesn't mean it's proof, but there's a lot of evidence on the empirical side, and also there's theoretical ways to conceive that. So it's not impossible. Not
at all. It's highly possible.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. And then just volume 2, the final chapter, talks about the united message of all world religions. And for me, it's so important to show the importance of religion now, which has got such a bad press, because it's stuck in a completely literal interpretation without any understanding of the allegory and the metaphor and the parable.
Yes.
So religion is imbued with wisdom when understood correctly. So chapter 9, or I think it is, it really shows with evidence how the great world religions are talking of the same thing. They cut the cake in different ways, but one can see that all the pieces of the cake, how they line up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then volume 3, it talks of the importance of symbology and mythology to transcend, to defeat the left brain. The left brain has its wonderful uses, but it's not the only use. Symbology opens doors that the left brain can never. The left brain shuts doors. Symbology opens them. And then associated with that are the powers in the human being. And this whole question of immortality from the standpoint of science and the perennial philosophy, evolution, destiny, and ultimately the primacy of consciousness.
Yes, yes. Some remarks to make here, if I may.
Yeah.
When you mention the apparitions and after death and so on, a reaction, knee-jerk reaction, we often find is is dressed up with all these deadly prefixes,
Yes, yeah.
paranormal,
Yeah, para, yeah, that's right.
pseudo science, right? Supernatural, anti this, anti that. But I want to make the remark here, and of course you can amplify it, and it's throughout the book, that if you like what we or many take for granted, like the default position, if you want, the starting prior, like where some of these discussions seem to have to start by, it's an anomaly. Let me explain. So we have Western science for 400 years, the anniversary, and except, well, you can discount the last 100 since the quantum revolutions, but it's like, well, it's a particular way to address particular problems, very successful, as you've said. It left aside consciousness programmatically. That was, okay, let's just not talk about this. Let's talk about the other stuff. We made a lot of progress. And it seems to be that the conclusion is disregard all these doors and say, well, then mind or consciousness is nothing but, and when I hear this expression, I always say caution, right? Caution. It's nothing but the brain activity, right? And that seems to be like something obvious and natural, but if you discount these 400 years and zoom out in time, and also zoom out in space and consider the many traditions, the indigenous knowledge of the peoples of the world, of the sages of the world forever, this view, the mainstream view, it's the exception. It's like the anomaly amongst what everybody considers as totally normal. And I think it's good to just point that out. Otherwise, we seem always to be so defensive, just trying to explain the impossible and the extraordinary, where, well, perhaps it's more the other way around. Like the burden of proof is on those who have claimed this for the first time in human history.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. The anomaly is really on your doorstep, not on our doorstep, so to speak. Yeah, I recall in one of Schrodinger's books saying science needs a bit of blood transfusion from the East. But the transfusion has got to be done carefully. We don't want blood clots. What he's saying is we don't want to discard the quantitative and precision and the methodology that science has given us, but it needs blood transfusion as well from the East, so that we don't get blood clots.
Exactly, and there's been let me just say there has been considerable blood transfusions already, because some of the insights of, again, the quantum physicists, we may go back to them. Well, at a time where they were getting the English translations of Vedanta and so on. So they've drawn from those fountains already. Not to say that the work wasn't original, because they did it with the instruments and the intellect of the time, which was remarkable. But again, it's not an anomaly. It's not a tip. It's not extra. It's not bonus track. No. Oh, let's get some of this Eastern thing sprinkled over it. No.
No.
It's in the system already.
And one of the saddest things, and I've said it so many times, it really makes me so sad, to use the word sad, and I mean sad, one can feel it, that the great scientists have pointed out this very thing that you're talking about. Eddington, for example, the universe is of the nature of a thought in a universal mind. The great Max Planck, for goodness sake, I regard consciousness as fundamental. We cannot get behind consciousness. Eugene Wigner, all of these Nobel laureates, it's really remarkable that the study of the external world has led to the scientific conclusion that the content of consciousness is the only, or is the ultimate reality. When Eugene Wigner at Cambridge, Nobel laureate physics, uses the word a scientific conclusion, I quote, he's not talking airy-fairy. So the sad thing is these great scientists have said this, but the mainstream ignore the thoughts of these great people, of the great scientists of the quantum era and earlier, of course, Newton's incredible alchemy and theology, and reducing Newton's tremendous thought to this stupid clockwork universe idea known as Newtonian science.
Often Newton wasn't that Newtonian, and Darwin wasn't that Darwinian. That's something we do, unfortunately.
Newton was not a Newtonian.
Yes.
And Darwin was not a Darwinian. He placed this survival of the fittest suits the egos of a lot of people. You know, I'm stronger than you. I can put more satellites in space than you, Elon Musk can, you know, and I'm bigger than you, and all this nonsense. Darwin, in his, not the origin of the species, in his Pedigree of Man, the word cooperation appeared dozens of times more than survival of the fittest. Cooperation.
Yes. Yes.
So Darwin was not just a Darwinian.
Yes. Let me go.
Well said. Yeah.
I think if we're finished covering this kind of bird's eye view of the 4 volumes for listeners to know what they'll find in them. And by the way, if you just double click on the index and see all the chapters, well, perhaps that's a way they can find that on the website, on your website. I mean, we can make that available for them to
and there's
read
now
the
an ebook.
Yes, perfect.
Ebook available. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to go back to the title of these 4 volumes,
right?
Consciousness and Unfolding. So it's the consciousness unfolding that writes these books about how consciousness unfolds. How to interpret that? Is it about the spiritual evolutionary understanding of the universe as ensouled, and that's what you're conveying with this title? Tell us about the title.
Yes, it's to show how that ultimate reality, by whatever name, will ever unfold and express itself through vehicles, through bodies, through material. And the point to get across is there isn't consciousness in matter. Consciousness expresses as matter. So thinking of E equals mc squared, energy doesn't express in matter. Matter expresses as energy. So that's a very wonderful analogy from physical science, showing as above, so below. Now, cheekily, I got the idea of the subtitle, exploring the living universe and the intelligent powers of man, from the book on human evolution by Brian Cox, where he talks about the only 3 things: physics, chemistry, and time. That's how the human being has come about. I saw that title in Waterstones, which really irritated me. So I thought, well, I'm going to have a subtitle exploring the living universe. Everything lives. What do I mean by live? Everything moves from being into becoming through time. Of course, we need time, but there's no such thing as dead matter. So the intelligent powers in nature, how can a tree produce fruit without intelligence? It's not brain and cerebral intelligence, but there's universal mind. So that the principle of consciousness unfolds as what we see as the intelligent powers in nature and in man. It's always unfolding, the verb, not unfolded.
Yes. And exploring. Not just exploding or just telling the answer, but it's a journey. It is a journey. These are now, I think we're reaching the end of this first installment, but there are at least 2 very important aspects I'd like you to comment on. Plus a third one, which is about you yourself, why you wrote this book. But before we get there, and actually you just mentioned it, and it's in the subtitle, and I can read it behind you. These powers, right? these intelligent, latent, often latent powers. This is not only interesting, this is so important, at least to me, right? Because I read a lot of books, and often my wife says, well, it's great you're reading all these books, but are you embodying that, right? Now the promise or the just the mentioning that there are these powers in us and then they're sleeping, that we have them, but we don't express them.
Yes.
It just immediately takes us away from academic armchairing or ism versus ism.
Yes, well said.
Well, what are those powers? And are we talking about the X-Men here? And perhaps all these novels and science fiction movies are just showing us something we could do, but we just don't believe we can. We don't take it seriously because why? I don't know, because it's so scary. What are those powers, latent powers?
Let us start very simply. It's an old saying that you can't really know something or learn something unless you already know it. Well, that sounds paradoxical, but when you were 2 or 3 years old, you didn't know much or anything about neuroscience and calculus and mathematics, but that was a latent power, if you like, a latent ability that evolved as you were growing up. So in a very homely physical sense, what was latent in you as a future neuroscientist, professor, head of Pari, was latent in you as a child. Another way of looking at latent powers is a bud of a flower and the various petals that evolve from it. If the flower is subjected to water, rain, sunshine, moving on, those latent powers are really powers of consciousness. First, we have obviously physical sight, then we have insight, sight into, then genuine clairvoyance. And I would say, honestly, Alex, that wonderful research that you are doing almost probably uniquely on extra-auricular vision. And also, in your last email to me, you mentioned remote viewing. That is a latent power. So there are infinite capacities that will flower when given the right circumstances and not without considerable danger, of course, when forced.
Yes. And maybe it's a change of tone, but in a comical way, something was going through my mind as you were saying this, which is like, if that would be a grant that we write to get some funding in the usual zombie mode, where we say, okay, perennial philosophy is this and that, the references, like expected impact, right? The expected impact, it's huge.
It is massive, yes.
It is humans being able to express something that perhaps we're trying to compensate by amplifying technology, but there's a safer and more natural way to do so through our own capacities.
Through our own internal evolution.
Yes. And the transformation you were discussing. Right. Yeah, you were mentioning at the beginning. Sure. Well, we'll read and talk more about those latent powers.
But you had 3 questions. That was your first.
Yes. The second one, it's also very important. It's a phrase you use and you don't hear it often. Universal brotherhood of humanity.
Yes, of course. Brotherhood, it doesn't mean just male gender. It's an old-fashioned term, brotherhood and sisterhood.
Yeah.
It was the first object of the Theosophical Society, which I think is such a wonderful principle, that unless there is a feeling of universality amongst all of us, then these latent powers and what science has discovered will be seed on barren ground, or worse, will be misused and abused. So the Theosophical Society, if I can mention this exactly in connection with your question, the first principle was not to divulge occult science and all of that, but really to inculcate the universal brotherhood, without which occult science and the higher knowledge would be distorted, abused, misused. So there really has to be a feeling in consciousness of moving away from I, me, and mine to us, we, they, and them, which is not uniformity. It is realizing that we are part of one family, yet we are unique. And that's the paradox. Mm-hmm. When I say we, you and I, us, it doesn't mean we're all the same. We realize the family aspect, but we are unique in the same way as each organ in the body is unique, but it's part of the family we call the body. Mm. So brotherhood is not just an airy-fairy idea. It can be, and it is, a fact in nature. Because the whole of nature is like one organic being. And if you hurt one part of nature, you hurt other parts. Look at the climate issue now, yes, as one example.
So we can see the Hermetic principle again at work here, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Well said. Yes.
And how coherent, right? That in talking about these issues, one of the consequences, if I can put it this way, is that perhaps we may attain higher human unity.
Yes. Yes.
And again, we're off the bounds of pure academic or intellectualization of ideas, which we will do, but also things that are relevant to our everyday life. Yes. Yeah. Okay, final one. Just
sure.
To know something about you, about why you wrote this book. I know it took you a couple of decades. So I think it's appropriate also for those who will listen to us speak.
It's still unfolding, Alex. It's still unfolding.
Yeah, that they know something more about Edi, the man who wrote this book.
Oh, right. All right. So you're asking me to talk about myself?
Yes. Why not?
Yeah. One of the most wonderful things that happened to me, thanks to, let's call it destiny, was that I was born in the East and manufactured in the West. So my raw material is Eastern. I was put together and built up in the West. So I'm equally happy in both hemispheres and both sides of the argument. So I was born in Bombay. My religion is the Parsi Zoroastrian, the old Iranian. That said, my whole approach is a universal attitude to religion. So religion is the one language. So you can't be a linguist until you start with one language. You can't learn all at the same time. So
yes,
in that sense, I'm a Parsi Zoroastrian. When I studied at university, I realized very early on that wonderful as science and engineering were, that it was only part of the story. And when I took a serious course in astrology, which is something people talk rubbish about, it really showed me with evidence, looking at horoscopes and looking at the evidence, that there seemed to be something rather more than what physical biology and science would happily tell us. My academic life was in 3 universities, and then I always at the same time kept a tremendous keen interest in music, and I still try and practice the piano every day. At least an hour and a half, 2 hours would be a good idea. Music is absolutely central to my being. It is not icing on the cake, because it shows that there are thoughts, there are feelings, there are experiences that cannot be felt and expressed in any other way. And along with music, I would certainly say poetry and great religion as well, great literature as well. So I decided not to go into academia because I wanted a rather more practical angle to working life. So I worked in a whole variety of industries, the oil and gas, petrochemical, electrical, construction, now in the defense industry, keeping always a parallel interest and a working life in the esoteric philosophy. I was deeply involved with the Theosophical Society nearly half a century, and at the same time, almost, or in parallel, with the Scientific and Medical Network. So a few strings to the bow.
And what drew you to write the book?
Right, what drew me to write the book was to, to address the various problems and discussions and arguments, not only in science, but also in theosophy and in esoteric circles, about what is the greatest teaching, what does this mean, what does that mean. I felt there had to be a way of drawing it together.
This thread, the golden thread.
Yes, to display the golden thread. Yes,
okay.
That's right.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I suppose people will get to know you, get to know us better as we speak. Well, just in wrapping up, unless there's something else you want to add, I just say, well, this is a first invitation. I mean, I do this for the sake of it, but if people listen to this and it's valuable, well, this can be also an entry point, not just to your books, but of course to all these teachings. We encourage them to get the books and read them, but if people cannot afford to do it or don't have the time to do it, well, this is in a way also kind of a social offering, and they can listen to them while they're cooking or walking. Right. So we hope we will, we just cover slowly but steadily all the chapters of your book and appendices, and who knows where we'll end, but it's certainly a good start, I think.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah. We need to show people that nature, what we call nature, is not just a coincidental coming together of atoms under blind mechanical law. We need to show, always with evidence, that there is mind and a divine principle behind all that we see. And there is a way of understanding those principles.
You see, and it's so paradoxical, because to show them what they already know, to show us what we already know. What
is inside us, but to bring it out, Yeah.
And to express it. Yes.
Lovely.
Well, I'll add, this is the last thing, that in talking to you, I always come out with this sense of calm and also purity, which are
thank you. That's
which are things we don't hear either too much about, and it's so lovely because it's like my spirit is tempered, and
that's very.
And there's a purity. I mean, I'm not declaring myself pure now, but I'm just saying, I feel it every time we speak. There's like this sense of calm and sincerity and purity. Thank you, Edi.
Thank you, Alex. And the sincerity is a word that means a lot to me. It really means being aware of one's limitations.
Okay. Well, more soon.
Thank you.
Our age is proud of the progress it has made in man's intellectual development. The search and striving for truth and knowledge is one of the highest of man's qualities. Though often the pride is most loudly voiced by those who strive the least. And certainly, we should take care not to make the intellect our goal. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality. It cannot lead, it can only serve. And it is not fastidious in its choice of a leader. This characteristic is reflected in the qualities of its priests the intellectuals. The intellect has a sharp eye for methods and tools, but is blind to ends and values. So it is no wonder that this fatal blindness is handed on from old to young, and today involves a whole generation.